Hello again, everyone. This is video 7.2, where we're going to be talking about the different stages of the faith journey. Remember that we are on a journey of discipleship our entire lives. The more time we spend as a disciple of Jesus, the more we look like him. But we're never going to reach that goal in this lifetime of being fully like Jesus. So as we've talked about discipleship in this course, we've tried to be sure to keep that entirety of that journey of discipleship in mind. When we as individuals or churches develop our discipleship strategies, it's really easy to focus more heavily on one stage of that faith journey or another. Maybe it's a focus on evangelism with unbelievers, or maybe it's developing leaders in your church. And it's okay to have a natural tendency or one stage of discipleship that you're particularly gifted in. But we need to have a full picture of the discipleship journey and know how to disciple both ourselves and others all along that spectrum. So in order to accomplish this, for this course, we have identified 3 stages on that discipleship journey. Now, this isn't the only way or the right way to identify the discipleship spectrum. It's just the way that we've decided to approach it in order to be sure that you have a variety of discipling experiences. So we've divided the discipleship journey into 3 stages: emerging faith, engaging faith, and empowered faith. We've already mentioned them a few times earlier in this unit, so you may have already identified them by now. But now is when we're going to take the time to explain them more fully, since understanding these 3 categories is going to be important for you as you go about your summative assessment. So let's start with emerging faith. People in the emerging faith stage are unbelievers or pre-Christians. They haven't yet reached a point of belief that results in making that confession of faith and commitment and baptism. And it's important to understand that even within each of these 3 stages, there's still a spectrum of belief. It's not just, okay, you're a believer or an unbeliever, and we approach discipleship for every believer in this way and for every non-believer in this way. And in this particular stage, the emerging faith in particular, it has a really broad spectrum within it. And it seems like we're actually experiencing a lengthening of that spectrum a bit in our context, as we're seeing a transition from a Christian culture to a post-Christian culture. There's a few ways you can identify what kinds of things you'll find in this stage in order to best help you think through a discipleship strategy for emerging faith individuals. You could think of atheist to agnostic to seeker, or antagonistic to apathetic to acknowledging, resisting, questioning, and then responding. Gary Rohrmeyer, who led the Converge church planting organization, came up with a spiritual journey guide in which he identified components of this stage as not interested, curiously seeking, and assertively seeking. The non-interested phase is identified by things like, it's okay for you, but not for me. They're aware, but not interested, and there may be misconceptions or a negative view of Christianity. The curiously seeking are open to spirituality. They realize there's maybe more to life than what they've already experienced, and maybe still struggle with a negative image of Christianity, though. And then the assertively seeking are taking positive steps to find answers. They're seeing a difference between Christianity and other religions, and they're beginning to grasp the implications of Christ's claims. So you can see that within just this emerging faith stage, you're not necessarily going to be able to have a one-size-fits-all discipleship strategy, because even within that stage, people can be at very different places. And before I move on, I think we need to be clearly stating in all of our ministry classes and seminaries that we are entering an unprecedented shift that requires us to rethink evangelism and discipleship. We have centuries of precedent full of examples and strategies for discipleship and evangelism in a pre-Christian context, from ancient times with Paul and his missionary journeys to the mission work in Africa that was really prevalent in the last century. And we also have that precedent for discipleship and evangelism in a Christian or God-following context from ancient Israel until now. But since about the end of World War II, we've seen, first beginning in Europe and now in America, especially on the two coasts, we have entered or are entering a post-Christian context where there has been a dominant Christian culture for centuries. Now that culture is receding. And this isn't something to be afraid of. God can and will work mightily in a post-Christian context, just as he has and will in pre-Christian and Christian contexts. It just means that we need to acknowledge this shift and the fact that some of the discipleship strategies we've relied on may not fit as well in post-Christendom. So we're in the precedent-setting time right now where we don't yet know all the best strategies and tools, but it's such a significant time to really listen to and look for God and get creative and try things out and make mistakes, but also have amazing victories. And we can look to Europe to see what they've been discovering over the past few decades. And I hope that we'll also look to and come to rely upon the church in Latin America and places in Africa and Asia that's growing while churches in America shrink. I think God is going to be working in powerful and new ways in the next decades, forcing Christianity to look differently in the world than it has, and giving us the opportunity to catch another tiny glimpse to expand our small understanding of the full expanse of who he is. And I am just so excited for this. There are a lot of unknowns, but there are things that we're learning already. And one of those is that in post-Christendom, that emerging faith spectrum has been extended further away from that conversion moment on the faith journey. Christendom provided a context in which evangelism could take place and make sense. You could maybe think of it now that we are adding pre-evangelism, a pre-evangelism phase in post-Christendom that you have to go through before you can even enter into the evangelism phase, in which most of those evangelistic practices and tools that we're familiar with would be helpful. That means we can expect to spend a much longer time with people, walking with them on that journey toward faith than what was maybe the norm in decades past. I would love to spend a lot more time on this, but since this is a discipleship course, not strictly evangelism, we are going to move on. But I do want to direct you to a book called Church After Christendom, and it's listed in the additional resources at the end of this module. This book looks more at that pre-evangelism or the extended evangelistic journey, and I think would be helpful as you develop your comprehensive discipleship strategy. So after the emerging faith comes engaging faith. This stage begins at that point of conversion. People in this stage on Gary Rohrmeyer's Spiritual Journey Guide are making a faith commitment, actively following, and they're growing in fellowship. These could be newer Christians, but I also think a large portion of established Christians would also be in this stage. This could be those back row attenders, or what we may think of as nominal Christians, those who participate in some of the Christian practices, but it doesn't necessarily carry over into any meaning in their lives. Or you could also think of the consumer Christian who wants to simply be fed every week, having the best worship service and the most inspiring teaching. So you can see how a discipleship strategy for this stage is going to look very different than the emerging faith stage. Good places to focus discipleship in the engaging faith stage might be growing knowledge and understanding of Scripture, developing spiritual practices, and connecting with the faith community in a meaningful way. You'll notice that I have knowledge in the engaging faith stage, not the emerging faith stage. This is, I think, one of those differences, another one of them, between Christendom and post-Christendom. In the past, knowledge has played a large role in evangelism, which would be that emerging faith stage. And the progression used to be knowledge community action. So people learn enough about God in order to believe in Him. And because of that belief, they participate in a community of faith. And as a part of that community of faith, they begin to engage in the things of God: service, giving, caring, and so on. But now that progression is more reversed. People want to participate in good things. They like seeing faith in action. And often the first step someone takes on the faith journey is joining you in some kind of serve project. And relationship is the other important first step. People are drawn to community, and when they are allowed to participate with community and see that the things of that community are good, that then is what leads to belief. In Church After Christendom that I mentioned earlier, Stuart Murray presents it as believing before belonging in Christendom and belonging before believing in post-Christendom. But this doesn't mean that knowledge isn't important. The engaging faith stage is a great time for it. Now you believe in God, let me tell you more stories about how He has interacted with His people in the past. Let's talk about the fruits of the Spirit that you want to begin seeing activated in your life as a believer. So for the engaging faith person, great places to focus discipleship are on gaining knowledge through Bible study, developing those spiritual disciplines and practices, and connecting with and taking ownership in a faith community. The last stage then is the empowered faith stage. This is the reproducing or making an impact phase in Rohrmeyer's spiritual journey guide. Empowered faith individuals are deeply intimate with God, and they have developed spiritual practices. They are learning how to effectively share their faith. They're maybe mentoring others and finding out how to use their spiritual gifts in their faith community. So here's where we start thinking about leading leaders. It's easy to know when someone transitions from that emerging faith to engaging faith, because that transition is marked by their confession of faith or baptism. But it's harder to know when someone's transitioning into the empowered faith stage. One of the markers for me is by looking at a person's decision-making process. When someone's faith becomes not just an integral part of their decision-making, but a driving factor in it, that's a sign to me that they are entering the empowered faith stage. Maybe it's being convicted that the way they're living is not in line with God's desire for them, and they make a change because of that. Maybe it's faith driving their decision about a move or a job opportunity, or a decision to give more maybe. Some areas to focus discipleship in the empowered faith stage is giving people opportunities for leadership and identifying their spiritual gifts and helping them learn how to use those. I also want to add that one of the easiest ways to help people transition from engaging faith to empowered faith is letting them disciple you. Remember that discipleship line is a two-directional line going both ways, and this is where that becomes really important. I would just add that you need to give them the opportunity to disciple you without overburdening them. It can be really easy to get someone to this stage after a lot of hard work and then say, man, this is so helpful. Here, take all of this. And it's especially easy to do this if you're in a smaller church. So just keep that in mind. How can they disciple you in a way that helps them feel empowered in what they have to offer, but not overburdened? So the 3 stages on the discipleship journey we are working with for this course are emerging faith, engaging faith, and empowered faith. And if you've read through your summative assessment, which hopefully you have by now, you'll see that you're going to be discipling 3 people, 1 in each of these different stages, which means the discipleship strategy you come up with for each person will probably look different. Actually, it should look different. The last 3 modules will walk through each of these stages more closely, giving you some direction and some tools. But before we wrap up this video, I want to point out just a couple more things. First, this discipleship journey isn't always a straight progression from one end to the other. People can also move backward. Most of Missio, our church, is made up of de-churched people. So this is people who have had some sort of church experience in their past, but they haven't been a part of a church for one reason or another in the recent past. Whether that's because they didn't believe anymore, they had had a bad experience, or maybe they just stopped going to church when they left the home of their family of origin, after leaving high school. Based on their story, de-churched people can fit either more into the emerging faith stage or the engaging faith stage. And sometimes a large part of discipleship is focused on helping someone work through church trauma of some kind. So just remember, it's not always straightforward. Sometimes there's moving backwards. And finally, I want to point out that this faith or discipleship spectrum can also be an effective tool for your discipleship as a spiritual diagnosis tool. It's helpful for you to be able to place where people are on their faith journeys, but it's actually also helpful for other people as well. People actually like being able to identify themselves to you, especially when they find out you're a Christian. They feel some security in letting you know where they stand. Sometimes they want to be sure it's clear that they are not in the same place as you. You're here, but I'm way over here. Or sometimes it's the other way around, that they actually want you to know that they're a little closer to you than where you might think they are. I know you may think that my beliefs are completely different than yours, but I actually kind of think this. So it just gets the authenticity out there so each person knows where the other stands in order to alleviate some potential awkwardness. You can use this faith spectrum to create a simple spiritual diagnosis tool that gives people the opportunity to identify themselves. We have a friend who printed up business cards with this spiritual diagnosis tool on the back. So when he meets with people, he can pull it out and turn the card over and ask people to just point out, where do you fall on this spectrum here? Or you could just grab a napkin and draw a line with the number 1 at one end, number 10 at the other, and ask them to just point, where do you think that you would be if 1 is antagonistic toward Christianity and 10 is a believer fully engaged in church and spiritual practices? Whew. All right, that was a lot. I hope you have a good understanding of these 3 groups now and how we're using them in this course and for your summative assessment. And then we will dive into each of these further in the next modules.